I'm Luca Giliberti, contributing writer for Gold Derby, and I'm joined today by Oscar and BAFTA-nominated production designer Maria Djurkovic, who is here to talk about her latest project, My Policeman. So Maria, to start things off, I would like to ask about your initial reaction to reading the script for the first time, for this movie for the first time. You know, what were some of the thoughts, some of the ideas, some of the images that went through your head after you put that script down for the first time? And what ultimately compelled you to say yes to this project?
Okay, well, it's interesting. I actually got sent the script for this project right at the start of the first COVID lockdown.
Wow.
Basically, Michael Grandage sent me the script. This was before the film was fully financed. It was that time, I think, when everyone was suddenly lockdown hit everybody. And I think I actually ended up during that period working on 3 different projects, just doing mood boards, actually as part of the process to try to get, the project underway. For me, that initial response about mood and atmosphere is absolutely crucial. It doesn't matter what the project is. And I know one of the ways that I know if I should be doing a particular film or not is whether I do see pictures immediately. And I absolutely did on this. It had a very strong atmosphere and a very evocative mood. And my process that I always, whatever the film is, if I feel it's the right project for me, I have to see those pictures from the reading straight away. And it is it's a very emotional response to a project straight away. And then I do a ton of visual research, in a slightly OCD way. And the best bit of any film for me is discovering the look, the language of it, the color palette, the mood, its sensibility. And that has to come from the script. It really does. I would never impose a look onto a film. The look of it comes from the material. And I had the luxury on this project, as I said, I was employed specifically to do a mood board. And it's interesting because Amazon obviously have asked us we have to do submissions for the ADG. We sent ours in this morning, and I was working on it with my supervising art director, and we put this PDF together that has images from the initial mood boards and photographs, stills from the actual film. And it's always such a surprise that initial instinctive response to something travels, a year later, or in this case, a year and a half later, and you're seeing those images on the screen. And it's interesting how important those very initial feelings and responses are. And it was very, as I said to you, this piece is about mood and atmosphere. That's so crucial to it, and creating, and it's also quite an interesting way of setting, it's the social nuances.
Yes.
In Britain in the 50s, I mean, we have such a class-ridden society, and it's the nuances between Tom's much more working class background, and then, and then comparing that to Patrick's completely different sort of social level, all that stuff. Plus, obviously, the 2 periods, doing the 50s and then again the 90s, was very seductive to me as a designer, and particularly so because I did this mood board, and Michael Grandage really responded well to it. In fact, I don't think we made any changes to it at all. So when, several months later, the Amazon was the studio and we were going to make this film, it was very easy and a bit of a no-brainer to say, yes, thank you. I would love to do the job.
That's really interesting, and I didn't actually know that you had to compile a mood board for the ADG Awards. So that's very interesting. And
it's not a mood board; it's a document, and every designer.
Oh, it's a document. Okay.
It's a document where you're doing you're basically trying to showcase the work of the art department.
Right.
And so in it, because for me, those initial, your initial question was in response to the script,
exactly,
and that is such an important thing for me as well, that I actually wanted to go back to that. So that was me, not everybody. I'm sure nobody else is probably doing that. Everybody else has got photographs and drawings, but because to me it's so key how you actually feel about a piece from the word go. and how interesting it is, how for me, the most enjoyable part of any film is that initial figuring out at the very earliest stage what it's going to feel like. So in this case, where you've got two periods, you know, people say questions like, oh, what are the challenges of doing the 50s and the 90s? Those are not the challenges, you know, that period stuff should be, you know, in our DNA, that in the same way as a designer, you're always looking at character. That is totally fundamental. The enjoyable bit for me is actually finding how you make an aesthetic whole and how you can combine the 50s stuff and the 90s stuff and make it quite seamless. And I know, talking to Michael from the beginning, it was very important to him that it was one aesthetic piece.
Right.
And that you almost don't know, the two time periods have to flow very seamlessly, one to the other.
Absolutely. And we'll actually get to that a tiny bit later, but you had mentioned the color palette earlier, which is something that really stood out to me in the movie, because at least to me, in the movie, it feels almost quite limited all around. And I would say purposely so, right? I feel like there were a lot of greens, there are a lot of blues, there are a lot of browns. We have some beige in there. So, you know, did that palette arise out of some of the research that you did, or was it used more so to convey atmosphere and tone, or was it some of both?
The color palette came from the location. You know, Brighton and Peacehaven have very specific look. You know, you've got sea and you've got sky.
Yeah.
And you've also have at Brighton, there's this very particular color palette that most of the stucco buildings all along the seafront are sort of ivory. And then there's this very strong turquoise color on all the cast iron railings that are everywhere. So that it's a bit of a no-brainer. I mean, you know, you take what you can from the locations that you have. And Peacehaven is really interesting because it's actually a terribly depressing place. I'm going to offend people. I know I'm going to offend people. It feels like it's got this extraordinary natural landscape, but the human element is sort of slit your wrists time. And it's, in a way, what was difficult. The 50s stuff is sexy and fun, and, you know, that it has a visual vivacity to it. Whereas the 90s world was actually really quite depressing. And the bungalows that are built on that coastline are quite depressing. And so to try to sort of bring them a little bit to life, that, if anything, was the most challenging part. It's also, so, you know, the color palette comes from the script, from the research, and from the locations. And for me, the obvious place to start is looking at artists from that period. And, you know, there's a lot of English. I was looking at a lot of Borden and Revilius and Nash, who basically have the atmosphere for the piece. I was looking at a lot of those woodcuts and prints, actually, from that kind of period. Actually, when I was at school, there was a rather beautiful Borden lino cut of Brighton Pier. And that was my initial thing. I had to pass it going to French class. And it's interesting how, as designers, you know, you accumulate a visual vocabulary. You know, like I always say to students, it's really important to go to exhibitions, to go and see stuff, to understand architecture and art, because that's what you're using when you come to designing a film. And I found it quite amusing that my initial thought was that lino cut that was outside my French class while I was still at school. Anyway,
that's a great memory. And you know what I like about the color palette is that we also see it, you know, on the inside. And I actually would like to talk about some of the smaller, more intimate spaces, starting with Patrick's apartment, which really stands out because, you know, it's very much his and Tom's safe space and contains, I think, a lot of personality. So, you know, walk me through some of the details of that apartment, and, you know, to what extent you incorporated that sense of comfort, of safety into it.
well, I think with Patrick, you know, you're saying a lot about this particular character. He's cultured, he's worldly, he has a good eye, he's one of my particular pet hates is when you're doing a period film and everything in that set is like on the nose from that period. And I certainly don't, some people do live like that. Patrick certainly would not be one of those characters. He draws, he paints. It was very important for us to, again, I'm going to be offending people left, right, and center. I absolutely knew that what we couldn't have was one of those sort of film portraits that you see on movies. And I knew that we had to get something really quite special. And my set decorator of like 21 films, Tatiana MacDonald, and I, we've worked together for years. We're kind of like telepathic with one another. And she has a very good friend who's an artist. And actually, she's a serious artist who charges and gets paid a lot of money for her work, quite rightly so. And Tap asked her, it was lockdown, she was, she said, would you fancy doing the Harry portrait? But not just the Harry portrait, then there have to be other drawings that Patrick has done in that apartment. And to our astonishment, she agreed to do it and just charge the normal rate that we would pay anyone else to do it. So that was a very key thing for me, is his drawing says a lot about him. And it's just one of those things that, particular things that I can't stand, like badly photoshopped photographs where the head doesn't fit the body. It's really not terribly good drawings you get on a lot of movies. So I think she did a wonderful job. And he actually, they gave him his drawing as a crew gift afterwards. He was very fond of it. That's nice. But also just in terms of his, we gave him quite an eclectic art collection. We gave him quite an eclectic decor, in fact. And it was sort of important to make it feel like when Tom goes to see Patrick's, he enters his apartment for the first time, he really is entering into a world that he's very, very unfamiliar with. And, it's everything that he doesn't know. There's something seductive about it. So that was what was important. But at the same time, to try to give him, years worth of accumulation. He's got stuff from the mother, the cottage that they go to for the honeymoon, that was Patrick's mother's cottage. And, you're saying a lot about, I guess, several generations worth of culture in the environments that they live in.
Absolutely. And, and then, to contrast Patrick's apartment with Tom's and Marion's home, which, while still beautiful, I feel is a bit, bereft of personality almost, I would say. The walls are very plain. There aren't a ton of pictures hanging around, and even their bedroom, feels very empty for such an intimate space, all of which obviously makes a ton of sense within the context of the story. So talk a little bit about how you approach the inside of their home, and, whether there was ever even the attention to create a contrast between Patrick's apartment and it.
It's an intention to I suppose, to show what you can visually, which sort of basically draws the picture of how those characters live. And, they're a young married couple. They don't have stuff. They are on quite a modest economic, scale, that they've just moved into a rented place, and, they have what they need. There's the sofa, the table, and a few books on the bookcase. It's not yet kind of completely. Later on, when you see their home in Peacehaven, that has years of accumulated stuff. It's the same couple. And I used a sort of version of the same color palette in both those homes. Very early on, maybe because I was looking at all these graphic prints, I felt that florals were not right for this piece. And Annie, the costume designer, and I decided not to use florals and just to use these blocks of color. And it's interesting how, a decision like that makes some sort of difference. It's a subliminal thing. It's not a heavy-handed statement or anything, but it just shifts things a little bit. So I was quite keen to use these blocks of color, almost like those woodcut prints, where you are printing with blocks rather than using a ton of patterns everywhere.
That's interesting. And, you've mentioned the 1990s timeline so often now, and I think that's a perfect place to wrap things up, because I would like to dig into the timeline and talk about Tom and Marion's home there, because obviously we're in a different location now, we're in a different time. A lot has happened in these characters' lives between the late 50s and the 90s. You can feel that sense of regret, that sadness, that melancholy, and how it's really set in these characters. So, how did you go about reflecting all of that in the design of their home in the 1990s?
Well, it's interesting because when that mood board, that initial mood board I did, which I was talking about, I found, online somewhere an image of a particular bungalow on a cliff at Peacehaven, and we put that into the mood board. And when Michael and I were out looking at locations, you walk along that sort of run of bungalows that are facing the sea, and we went backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards, and Michael kept on coming back saying, the one in the mood board is the best. So the house that we actually ended up using for the exterior is the house that we put into the mood board. I'd not even been to Peacehaven at that point. Michael had, I hadn't. And that was that house. That's what I'm talking about when I was saying at the beginning, your initial instincts for me are such an important thing. So anyway, that's set, that was our exterior. And then the interior we built, this was the craziness that when things, the film industry took off again during lockdown, there was no studio space. I mean, England, the studios were full, and we ended up having to build that interior. It was craziness. We built it in sort of big industrial space attached to an airfield. I mean, imagine going to an airfield to shoot. But actually, because it was a private airfield and because it was in the middle of lockdown, we were lucky not so many planes were taken.
Oh my God.
I mean, it was ridiculous. And actually, it was quite a schlep out of London. And we were struggling with crew because it was so insanely busy that just to get people to do that extra 40-minute drive, but anyway, so the bungalow, it's all those things. It's as you said, it's years of unfulfillment, lack of fulfillment, melancholia. I mean, that coastline sure as it certainly has that, when you walk along, and often, as you can imagine, over here the weather's not so great, and you see those waves crashing against the cliffs, but it's kind of got it's so full of a sadness. It's quite extraordinary. And then, so the balance, I suppose, was to create the interior of the bungalow that reflected all of that. But at the same time, I hope, I was also aware that it couldn't be so, depressing or so bland or so neutral that you sort of, it's still cinema. We're still dealing with a visual art. So it was very important. And I suppose color was our friend, it always is. So hopefully by using a color palette that tied in with all the 50s pieces, it's that thing I was saying earlier on, you make it part of this aesthetic whole, that there is something about a mood and an atmosphere that from the minute you start watching the film till the minute it ends, you're part of that world. So that was the motivation behind the approach. And, it was very important working with Annie, the costume designer, that we had all our, the colors. And, you never have enough conversations together ever. It just doesn't happen. The train has left the station. And so you're rushing off doing your bit. But, there are a few moments where we kind of went, oh, that works. That was a good, because, and that's the thing. If you are working to a particular mood board, which we were, and that is a very clear, it's almost like a Bible that you're all looking at: director, DP, costume designer, the rest of my team. So hopefully it means that you end up with this sort of cohesive approach. And in a funny kind of way, I think the bungalow was the trickiest one. All that sort of nice 50s stuff in Brighton was in a funny kind of way, just because it is more fun and more seductive. It's actually easier to do. It's the stuff that could go the other way. And also, when you're in the high street, when they go shopping, Tom and Marion go shopping, you're doing, it's in the shop signs, that 90s thing. It's in that particular place. It's all actually quite ugly. You know, it's that thing of pulling that off.
Yeah.
That's well, I hope we pulled it off. I don't know.
Absolutely. And I can't elaborate too much because I fear we're out of time, but what I really liked is in the 1990s in Marion's room, I believe the walls are like green, and I thought that was almost like reflective of the green that she wore very often in the 50s in her costumes. I really liked that detail, and that's where I was like, I see the connection there.
But not just in, it was in the initial
everywhere.
That Tom and Marion were, you know, with their first home when they get married in that apartment, the living room was green, the bedroom was pink.
Exactly.
Then it's a color palette that runs through. And as I said, you know, we had a few of those rather wonderful lino cuts that we actually, I was saying it was a woodcut. It's a lino cut, of course, brain. The terrible thing is, you know, you work on one film and that's your life.
Yeah.
And then by the time you do stuff like this, your life has been on another movie.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because that was 1957 and the movie I've just finished is also 1957.
Wow.
But it's completely different. It's a completely different world because it's set in Italy. Mm-hmm. And I really enjoyed that. That was really a fun thing to do. The same era, but it couldn't be more different. And that's quite enjoyable.
Well, then I'm very much looking forward to seeing that project. But for now, Maria, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to Gold Derby today. It was such a pleasure to listen to you talk about this process. I really appreciate it.
Lovely talking to you. Thank you so much.